Hi, and thank you for joining us for Connecting Lincoln's Lyceum Address in the Classroom. I'm Erin Carlson-Mast, President and CEO of Lincoln Presidential Foundation, and I'm based in Chicago, Illinois. I'm delighted to be joined today by Annie Evans of New American History and Sarah Jenks of Every Museum, a Civic Museum. The chat is open throughout this session, and we hope you join us. We'll spend the next 60 minutes together in an interdisciplinary exploration of Lincoln's 1838 address and digital humanities resources, including introducing new learning resources available for middle school, high school, and AP US History level students. The resources we'll share today were designed to complement Lincoln Presidential Foundation's newest short documentary series, Fortifying Our Democracy, Lincoln's Lyceum Address. Both of these were part of a larger project we did here at the foundation that was made possible thanks to generous support from Iron Mountain. Annie, could you advance to the next slide? Thanks. So I thought I'd give a little bit of background on what led to this project. In 2022, we premiered our first short documentary series that was called Warning Signs: Lincoln's Response to Rising Tensions in the 1850s. And we did that project in response to several things, including some public misinformation we were seeing and a lot of comparisons to current political polarization and the interest in other periods of American history that had similar ideas about increases in this polarization and division and what was happening with our democracy. And the response we got from viewers was really overwhelming in a great way. And it also received significant external recognition, and that includes 4 awards, including an Emmy, which I am shown here holding with a colleague as we celebrate during a screening we held at Lincoln Home National Historic Site down in Springfield, which is where a lot of that series was filmed. Along with learning resources and programs for that, the entire project was named an Educating for American Democracy Exemplar Project. And all of those resources are available on our website, lincolnpresidentialfoundation.org, and the films are also available on our YouTube channel. We did learn a lot from that entire process. We'd never used Roadmap before. We had created the film separate from the lesson plans and learning resources. And so as we took stock of how that project went, we knew that we wanted to apply a lot of that learning to our next project. And so that second project was on Lincoln's 1838 Lyceum Address. And the reason why we chose that is because it's often discussed in civic circles and by experts as being one of Lincoln's most prophetic speeches. He titled that address "The Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions," and looked in his speech, he was talking about really concerning trends: a rise in mob violence and mob justice, an erosion of trust in political institutions that he was seeing, this lack of a unifying shared experience such as the revolution, and how all of those things were creating this condition for the potential breakdown of the constitutional democracy and the rise of tyranny. So we sought out experts in history, communications, and political science for that documentary series. And while all of them had written about or had familiarity with Lincoln and this address specifically, they weren't your typical Lincoln experts. So for example, and we have a picture of him here on the next slide, Dr. Saladin Ambar is a political scientist whose books include Malcolm X at Oxford Union, Racial Politics in the Global Era, and Stars and Shadows, The Politics of Interracial Friendships from Jefferson to Obama. So we premiered the film in October of 2023, so it's fairly new. And the public response has been wonderful and really similar in that people reported having a deeper understanding not only of the historical issues, but also different language, different questions to ask to talk about current issues that we're facing in our nation. And when it came to developing learning resources, there was really no question who we wanted to work with to develop those. And so before we move on to that, I'd like to play the brief trailer we have for Fortifying Our Democracy so that you can all get a flavor of that.
The 1830s were a very dynamic time.
This is the time when slavery enters in a big way into the national political arena.
It was a very violent period. Mob violence was a real problem. Lynchings, murders. It's a brutal, difficult time. Lots of is going to survive.
Alexis de Tocqueville visits the United States in 1831 and writes a glowing book, Democracy in America. Some say the greatest book ever written about the United States, as well as the greatest book written about democracy. And yet it's a period of considerable upheaval related to the rule of law. And that's, I think, what drew Lincoln to the Lyceum Address on that historic night in January of 1838.
The Lyceum Address invites us into the mind of a younger Lincoln already thinking about the major issues of his time.
Justice for all, irrespective of their background. That is what the Lyceum contributes like no other Lincoln speech. It is a profoundly prophetic speech. It's what we make of it rather than what was made of it at the time that I think is important.
Okay, can everyone hear me now? Erin, can you all hear me?
Yes. Go
Okay,
ahead, Annie.
sorry. And I apologize, were you not able to hear the audio in the beginning of the video?
Yeah, it didn't. And I think some of the background music wasn't in there, but that's probably the internet connection or something.
Okay, well, I just want everybody to know you will have a link to these slides at the end, and you will be able to watch the video as many times as you like. The videos are all embedded directly in the lesson. As you saw when we went out to them, you didn't get any of those annoying YouTube ads. So don't worry, you'll get to see the video and you'll be able to play it for your students with no issues. So again, my name is Annie Evans. I work for the University of Richmond in Richmond, Virginia, and I work at a project called New American History. If you've never heard of us, we are also partners in the Civics Now. We work with the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap Project, among other things. We're a member of that coalition along with the Lincoln Presidential Foundation and every museum, a civic museum. And Erin and Sarah and I have worked together in a number of different ways, but this was a really exciting project for us to be able to work directly with them and put together these learning resources. So I want to tell you a little bit about New American History very, very briefly and kind of show you how to get to these resources. That I think is the most important part. So I'm going to come out of the slides for a moment. I'm going to take you out first. This is our main website, newamericanhistory.org. And the way it's sort of organized, if you're looking for learning resources, whether it be the ones that we created with Sarah and Erin for the Lyceum Address, you can look up here at the Learning Resources tab, and it takes you directly to our library. We'll go there in a moment. Under journalism, we have a website, two websites, one called Bunk, and then recently we acquired the History News Network, which has been a collaboration mainly geared towards higher ed instructors for over 20 years. It was being retired at the University of George Washington University in DC. And so we decided that Bunk and University of Richmond would acquire that. So that's also under our journalism tab. We have Digital Maps, American Panorama. We also have the archive, the Valley of the Shadow, which is the first digital humanities project on the internet. It's had 30th anniversary last year. And under scholarship, we have our director is Ed Ayers, the historian. And so his last two published works, we've created all free digital assets, digital maps, videos, learning resources, a whole suite of tools for both of those pieces of scholarship. But to get to tonight's lesson, you're going to want to go under the learning resources here and that tab. And so when you click under learning resources, it's going to take you out to our library. Here you can put in a keyword. You can search by a topic. So if you know something in particular that you're teaching in the next couple of weeks, you can also search by reading level. You can search by grade level. So it's an age appropriate lesson. You can search for national standards that they're linked to. And then you can also search by different types of strategies, whether it be literacy, critical thinking and inquiry. You're looking to add more collaboration strategies to your lesson. I'm going to do search for Lyceum. And that's going to take you to this jump page that we created. So we actually, because we're the overachievers, we didn't just make one lesson with these wonderful videos that Erin shared with us. We made 3. So when Sarah and I sat down with Erin to talk a little bit about, you know, who do we want this lesson to target and what do we want students to get out of it, we very much wanted to have a middle school, a general high school, and an AP US history version of the lesson. So you can get to all 3 of those. Tonight, we're going to go with the history lesson that's kind of in the middle, the high school version. And so when you go out to the high school version, you see this says for educators at the top. And you also notice there's a button that says student version. The only difference between the teacher version and the student version is the teacher version includes things like the standards. So you hit the drop-down menu. There's all the national standards it's linked to, including the Educating for American Democracy roadmap. We also link out to teacher tips. So if you're a novice teacher, or if you're not as familiar with this particular topic, or if you're just looking for new strategies, we always suggest that people read through these teaching tips very carefully. We're always going to put the pedagogy strategies we use. We're going to tell you about where we got them. We're going to talk a little bit about external links that we use. So you can preview all that through this. And then we also have a little read for understanding section for students for you to preview. After that, we are using the 5 E's inquiry model, and the student and teacher version is identical. It is in student-facing language. So let me take you out to the student version. You notice it's navy blue, so it's kind of color-coded. So the students jump right in. They have this brief little preview in the read for understanding, and then it takes them right out. The vocabulary is still there, and then they are going to look at the lesson. Just like we just looked at the YouTube, if you're looking at the video in our platform, you will not get all those external ads. If you're looking, if you need a graphic organizer for the lesson, it's already made for you. You can either print paper copies for your students, or you can have them make a copy and fill it out digitally. It's completely up to you. They just hit the back button and boom, they're right back in the lesson. So we hope, you know, if they have to analyze images, everything's already embedded in there for you. So you don't have to link a bunch of things together and go out and find all these things on your own. They're all provided for you. And Sarah's going to kind of break the lesson down and show you how that works.
Excellent. Are we ready for a handoff? Okay, great. I am so excited to be here today to share this speech with you. As a means of brief introduction, I was a history teacher, a middle school history teacher, and then was for a long time the director of education and interpretation at Ford's Theater in DC. So I know Lincoln speeches very well, and I even see some folks in the audience who are part of the Ford's Theater Oratory Fellows program. So excited to see familiar faces from that program and from others. What I'm doing now is working with organizations like Lincoln Presidential Foundation and New American History to support education and interpretation and strategic planning efforts, both for schools and for museums. So I'm super excited to be able to share this with you today. And especially because I'm embarrassed to say this is a speech I didn't know very well before I started doing this project, because my Lincoln period was the end of his life, not the beginning. And this speech is from 1838. So it's his really, really early on. It's his first, we believe it's his first public speech. 1838 is really still the Jacksonian era, at least in the way that we think about kind of large eras of history. And but when you listen to the speech or when you read it, it resonates, just as Erin was saying, profoundly. It is absolutely chilling, honestly, how well it resonates today. And we're going to look at the speech deeply. We're going to look at some excerpts because it's a fairly long speech. And then we're also going to talk about different strategies for teaching it. And so what can the Lincoln Lyceum Address do for us today? Next slide, please. Well, we don't think about the rule of law very much in this country, but I can tell you there have been more times in the last 4 years that I've thought about questions around the rule of law and the idea of the social contract that we all live under. What are the things that we agree upon that keep us from being a lawless society? Those are real. And there are times where you think maybe it's just gone. And what is it going to mean for us going forward? And the 1830s was a time when that was starting to happen. And the reason is because, next slide. I'm sorry, this is not the reason. But the other thing, I'll tell you that in a second. The Lyceum Address really does two things. First of all, it talks about the rule of law. And secondly, and in a way, in an effort to get us to be reminded of why the rule of law matters, Lincoln urges us in every generation to recommit to our country's purpose and value. And he says, even in 1838, they were just far enough away from the founding era that people couldn't remember what it felt like to found a country and to commit to something new, and that we have to do that in every generation. And it's really beautiful. And I'm hoping that we're going to go fast enough that we can get to look at those words today. All right, next slide. So this is actually what I thought was number 2, which is the reason that the rule of law was so in question was because there was an intersection of 2 really complicated things happening. And one of them was that white people were moving west, and they were trying to recreate the democratic practices that they had been able, white Anglos, right, that they had been upholding and creating and upholding on the East Coast as they moved west. And that was complicated, because they were displacing people, and they were, a lot of the people who were choosing to move west were not the ones who had been governing. So that was very complicated. And secondly, there were huge questions at this time about the role of the expansion of legal slavery and chattel slavery. And so the whole question of what was going to happen in these new Western territories, which we're going to discuss, which are now the Midwest, they're all along the Mississippi River. They were the West at this point for the people on the East Coast and for the people who were moving west from the East Coast. So these are the things that the Lyceum Address can help us to understand today. And we're going to explore them, and I hope you all are going to be willing to contribute and be part of this conversation. I want it to be a conversation. So let's get started. Can we go to the next slide, please? So when we first started doing this, I looked at the videos, and I'm going to take you through my thought process to a certain extent in this time together. How can we develop something that's really meaningful out of this speech? The perpetuation of our political institutions. Lincoln is 28 years old. He's never given a big speech before. And he's speaking to his colleagues, and frankly, he probably wanted to impress them. But this title is a mouthful. And one of the things that you'll see throughout this speech is that the speech is a mouthful. It's kind of one mouthful after another. And so one of the first things that I had to do was think, how are we going to make this accessible to younger people? And we've done that in a number of different ways, but that's something for you to keep in mind as you're thinking about how you might make use of this speech. So this speech is about Lincoln. It's Lincoln's words, so it's Lincoln's ideas. It's about mob violence and the 1830s. The quietest part of this speech is that it is also about abolitionism. And the reason that I say that it's quiet is because you have to read carefully to find the questions around slavery and abolitionism in this speech. They are not just like sometimes today, they are not the thing that everyone is talking about. It's like everybody don't talk about an elephant, right? Everybody is not talking about this big question. But this is the title of the speech. Is the rule of law essential to the perpetuation of our political institutions? Can you imagine a bigger question to ground a civics class or a history class? It's a huge question, but that's the question we went with. So next slide. Okay, so what I would like to do is start we're gonna watch one of the 3 segments of this video. And after we've watched it, I'm going to take you through some passages of the speech and share with you some of the strategies that we used to teach, to give you more resources to teach this speech. But I think seeing this will help you all to digest Lincoln's words. You know, just as we all have to build historical context in order to make sense of a document like the Lyceum Address, I think this is going to give you that historical context. So please make notes for yourself, or feel free to put things in the chat if you have questions as you're listening to it, or if you have ideas as you're listening to it, and then we'll look at them afterwards.
Who was visiting St. Louis, and he comes off of the ship and finds himself in a melee with local police who are trying to chase down a suspect, and they enlist McIntosh into this chase. And when he refuses, they arrest him. And such begins the sad and tragic tale of McIntosh, who, before he is incarcerated, strikes blow to one of the officers, a deadly blow, kills a police officer, and before long, a mob surrounds his jail cell, and they remove him forcibly, take him to the outskirts of what was St. Louis at the time, where he is chained to a tree and burned alive.
And they got away with it because when they were put on trial, a judge suitably named Judge Lawless, he actually let the mob go free.
William Herndon argues that this moment where McIntosh is killed spurs Lincoln to action to talk about the rule of law and democratic decline in Springfield that night in January of 1838.
Lincoln is saying everyone is entitled to due process of law, and it's corrosive for our whole community and for the whole country if we succumb to our passions in this way.
Okay. I thought that was going to be longer, but but that gives you a taste of the stories that drove Lincoln to make this speech, and that's the context that I wanted you to have. The thing about before we dig into Lincoln's speech, what I want to share with you are the things that we're going to go through today, and then I'm going to take you to, and Annie, we're going to go to the main lesson after this. Not yet. But we're going to go to the main lesson because I want to show you all the resources that we developed to help you teach the historical context, if you're interested in doing that. Uh-oh, we lost our video, our slides. Well, what I'll start by saying is, I did an experiment with this speech, which I'm be curious to hear from all of you about. So please feel free to chat, put something in the chat about it. Which is, it was so dense that I thought, frankly, even AP US history students are going to have some difficulty with it. They can probably get through it, but it's not going to be easy. And so we use generative AI to develop summaries at different reading levels of the speech. And we provide those to you. And what's not surprising, but really interesting about those is that they are essentially accurate. They get the gist of the speech, but they lose all of Lincoln's nuance and poetry. And so you really, it gives you an opportunity to have a conversation about what you can gain, which is a basic understanding of meaning, so that then you can go deeper if you want to go deeper with Lincoln's original words, with the understanding that that students and or teachers are going to have a little bit more of a background. So the first tool that we used in this lesson to make this speech more accessible was generative AI. And I'd be super curious to hear from you all, what you think of that. And my email is at the end of the lesson, so you can let me know if you look at it, what your thoughts are. Secondly, I did a deep dive into the three examples of mob violence that Lincoln refers to in this speech. And frankly, I will say this is the one piece that you can really thank me for, because they were not easy to find for the most part. One of them was, but the rest were not very easy to find. And the one that was described in the piece of video that you saw just now was the lynching of a man named Francis McIntosh, an African-American man who was free. He worked on ships, on boats, and he was from Pittsburgh. He was lynched in St. Louis in the earlier 1830s. And his death was actually documented through the lynching memorial project that is in Montgomery, Alabama. So there is a website about his lynching that was developed as part of that project, and you can learn more about it. But you're not going to see the newspaper articles that were written in the 1830s about it, and find those and then we have transcriptions of those newspaper articles for you. So you can actually see the people from the town saying, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to figure out, we're trying to get our slides back.
Keep talking.
Okay.
We come out of presenter mode. Okay.
Great. All right, good,
Keep
good,
going.
good.
It's fine.
Okay, so
Little technical issue here.
the good news is we're all educators here. Annie and I are. We can keep going. So in the case of the Francis McIntosh lynching, you have all of the the newspaper article that says we're the people of St. Louis. We know that you would have done what we did if you had been in our position. And this is what we keep finding. So I'm going to tell you now about the second issue that is discussed, which is that there was a series of lynchings that happened in Vicksburg, Mississippi, which is again on the Mississippi River. You might know about it from the Civil War, but it was considered the Wild West, essentially, in the 1830s. And the people who went out there, a lot of them were were involved. There were people who were involved in some sketchy things, who considered themselves doctors, but weren't really doctors. And the discussion then that's happening in the newspapers is, what are these people planning to do? Are they nefarious? And what people seemed to think, and again, you'll see this in the newspaper articles, is that they, along with a lot of gamblers who were also seen as troublemakers, were going to incite slave insurrections in Mississippi. And so you have all kinds of very crazy mob violence happening in Vicksburg in this period in the 1830s also. There's one book about it, but it is difficult to find much about it on the internet, honestly. So we have some newspaper articles, again, for you to look at that have been transcribed. And then the third piece, and this happened just outside of St. Louis, and this one you can find more about, is that a journalist named Elijah Lovejoy, was killed. And he was killed because he continued to insist upon writing about abolitionism and promoting the end of slavery. And people in the St. Louis area wrote him out of St. Louis into Illinois. And then after that, he tried to order a new printing press, and this mob came and destroyed his printing press so that he literally couldn't print the articles. And then they killed him and they burned the place that he was living.
Sarah, would you like to do the excerpt now, or would you like to go back to the slides and show?
Let's go back to the slides, and then we're going to go into the article.
Okay.
or I'm sorry, into the speech, the content of the speech.
Okay. Oh, all right. This
Is it
great.
happening?
I
You want
don't,
me to try to share?
that might be better. I don't know what's
Okay,
going on, but it jumped
let me
straight
see if
from
I
there to
can
the
share.
end. So I
Let
have
me
no
see
idea
if I
what's
can
going on. I'm
share.
gonna stop
Okay.
sharing because Zoom does not like me apparently tonight.
All right, well, the good news is we're doubled up here, so,
All right.
okay,
And do you have it?
yeah,
Okay, great.
Am I
Yeah.
not sharing anymore? Okay, there you go. Apologies. I don't know what's going on.
okay. So can you all see my sharing?
Yes.
Beautiful. All right, wonderful. I'm not going to go into slide mode simply because we're only going to be here for a second, and I just want to give you a sense. So the things that I think we can do using this speech are we can teach about the rule of law, we can teach civics, we can teach about this intersection between abolitionism and the expansion of slavery and the westward expansion. We can read deep on how mob violence and deep distrust in efforts to govern democratically were leading people to think that maybe this western part of the country wasn't going to be like the eastern part. And then we can discuss, and this is what we ask you to do if you go through to the next parts of the lesson, is to discuss these gifts bequeathed to us by the founders, and what the dangers are that threaten them. And then the last piece of the lesson, if you have kids who want to do project-based learning, or you have a group of kids who are really excited, is that, if we think about moments of refounding in the country, which is something that Lincoln talks about in this speech, what might be other moments of refounding? And how could you maybe create some classroom exhibits about moments of refounding in the country? And even just define what is a moment of refounding as a group. And Dean Ambar, the scholar that you heard speaking earlier, talks about creating muscle memory for democracy. And I love that phrase because it gives us such a powerful mnemonic reminder of what it is that we are striving for today and what we've been striving for over the years. So I am going to start by doing a bit of reading myself of the opening of Lincoln's speech. And I'm going to do that because I want to demonstrate that any of you can do it, A, and B, I'm going to ask some of you to volunteer. If you're willing, we'll take you off of mute to participate. And I know I have a few people in here who are not plants, but I know that they are willing to read aloud. So, Annie, could we go to the explain? It's the first segment of this. Oh, I'm doing this now. I can't say, sorry. Here we go. Annie, can you do? Okay, here we are. So first thing I want to share with you is you'll see this is the opening of Lincoln's speech rewritten by ChatGPT. And we're not going to read it out loud tonight because A, it's not poetic, and B, it's not a good use of our time, but feel free to read it to yourselves. It captures the gist, I would say, not the essence, but the gist of what Lincoln is saying, but that's just about all. But it's enough that it may give your students the sense of confidence they need to dig into Lincoln's words. So here we go. As a subject for the remarks of the evening, the perpetuation of our political institutions is selected. And here he's going to get real poetic. In the great journal of things happening under the sun, we, the American people, find our account running under the date of the 19th century of the Christian era. We find ourselves in the peaceful possession of the fairest portion of the earth as regards extent of territory, fertility of soil, and salubrity of climate. I think he could be any more wordy. We find ourselves under the government of a system of political institutions conducing more essentially to the ends of civil and religious liberty than any of the history of former times tells us. When mounting the stage of existence, find ourselves the legal inheritors of these fundamental blessings. So he's saying here, just to recap, fundamental blessings of a democratic society that offers civil and religious liberty, a land where we have fertile soil, nice climate, great territory, and we are in possession of this beautiful land. So we have some fundamental blessings. See how I'm doing this, like you've done this before, this reading thing, this like meta reading thing. We toiled not in the acquirement or establishment of them. They are a legacy bequeathed us by a once hardy, brave, and patriotic, but now lamented and departed race of ancestors. So we didn't have to work for this, but we have to appreciate it. Theirs was the task, and nobly they performed it, to possess themselves, and through themselves us, of this goodly land, and to uprear upon its hills and its valleys a political edifice of liberty and equal rights. 'Tis ours only to transmit these, the former unprofaned by the foot of an invader, the latter undecayed by the lapse of time and untorn by usurpation. Can you imagine having a middle school group of students read this? To the latest generation that fate shall permit the world to know. So we need to make this, we need to keep this country going. We need to make sure that it continues. This task of gratitude to our fathers, justice to ourselves, duty to posterity, and love for our species in general all imperatively require us faithfully to perform. So we got to do it. We got to do it for our ancestors, we got to do it for ourselves, and we have to do it for our children. We are not going to do this for too long. How then shall we perform it? At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, our own accepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, it is if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. I am curious, and I see the chat is going furiously, to hear thoughts from you all. Please add in the chat, what do you take away from this introduction? What do you think, what's he setting us up for here? Soil and climate, Timothy Meehan, I'm reading about your, yes, and we have another actor on as well, Victoria Reinsel, who's a teaching artist at Ford's. And actually, I was going to call on her to read the next passage. And I realize that I'm not giving either of you time to get to know these words, which you always are supposed to have before you might read them aloud. But I'm wondering if as you see this, we must live by all time or die by suicide. What is Lincoln is getting ready here to tell us that we are going to cause our own problems as we're doing in the West. And I'm curious to know if you have ever heard or thought of anything like this. All right, we're going to move on. So, before we do, so this passage, what we do is we introduce this at the beginning and we ask you to read it both in the AI version and in this version. And then and then talk about the difference. We're not even going to get deep into meaning here. We just want to say, like, if you see this poetic language and this deep meaning, and then you read the AI version, and you can understand the AI version really easily, what does it teach us about AI? And what does it teach us about the words of someone like Lincoln and why we might actually want to read the original? Okay, we only have 20 minutes left, but we're going to move on.
Sarah, there's been some good comments made in the chat. I don't know if you're able to see them. In addition to what James talked about, the passage with the soil, Victoria also said it reminded her a little bit of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. So
Yes.
for students who are taking, in Virginia, our students do world history in 9th and 10th grade, and then they do US history. So I don't know the scope and sequence for all 50 states. I realized we all have something a little different in each state, but students may be familiar with Shakespeare through their English class or Julius Caesar through their world history course in a previous grade level. So I think that's interesting that they can build on that prior knowledge. So that's a great comment from both James and Victoria.
Thank you so much. And similarly, if you know anything, if they know anything by any chance, they probably won't, about Bonaparte, they'll realize that Bonaparte was wanting to conquer all of Europe. And Bonaparte can never get us, but we could do ourselves in, right? So what's that about? I mean, that's fascinating stuff. So what we're not going to do today, but I will share with you briefly, pardon me, I'm going back and forth here a little bit. Isn't technology fun? Is that we have a couple of images here that you can do close looking on. This is the as it says below, the pro-slavery riot that led to the death of Reverend Elijah P. Lovejoy. And then also this is the image, and it's horrible, so prepare your students and yourselves before you look at it, of what happened in Vicksburg. And you can see all sorts of terrible things happening here. I mean, it's really bad, but yes, the early optimism about Illinois. Thank you so much, James, for writing that again. Absolutely. And so these two images are starting points. We also have a map if they want to look at it. You can only a little bit see it here, but we mapped all the different places that this violence was happening to show that they're all right along the Mississippi River. So this is all happening along the Mississippi, which at that point was the West. The next thing we're going to share here is, so we're going to do a reading of another paragraph. But before we do it, I just want to share with you that what you've got here in this article are primarily first-person accounts, or I'm sorry, not first-person accounts, primary sources. So this Vicksburg letter in defense of citizens' actions, and then a transcript of the letter. A commentary on Vicksburg from an abolitionist newspaper in Boston with a transcript. And then there are some other articles that are in the AP US History unit that are in addition to these, but we wanted to limit the number. And then this one is this account and defense of mob actions from the Nashville Whig is related to the lynching of Francis McIntosh in St. Louis. And there's a transcript here as well. And then this article about Elijah Lovejoy, which will give you, it's essentially a narrative from the 1940s of what happened. There's another article in the AP US History lesson that is from the time period that goes into great detail about what happened, but we didn't include it here. But you can obviously always go back and forth and mix and match whichever ones you want to use. But these articles will give you an opportunity to really understand both what was happening and also how people were reacting to it from an abolitionist perspective and in terms of defending mob violence, which is, it's a thing, it's a real thing. So that's the historical context that we're building. But let's look at this passage here, and I'll move to it because I have it here. And Victoria, I'm going to call on you if you'd be willing. And can we unmute Victoria? Hi,
Okay,
Victoria.
Victoria should be unmuted now.
Great.
I
Victoria.
am here.
Great. Can you see these words?
I sure can. Apologies for my post-COVID recovery voice.
Oh my
here,
gosh.
but-
Oh no. Well, thank you so much for being so game. And
All
it's just-
good.
and this paragraph is something for us to chew on in thinking about why we want the rule of law, why it's worthwhile. Because kids may not all understand what the value of the rule of law is, not even adults. But go ahead and give us a read, if you would, Victoria.
Sure thing. When men take it in their heads today to hang gamblers or burn murderers, they should recollect that, in the confusion usually attending such transactions, they will be as likely to hang or burn someone who is neither a gambler nor a murderer as one who is, and that, acting upon the example they set, the mob of tomorrow may, and probably will, hang or burn some of them by that very same mistake. And not only so, the innocent, those who have ever set their faces against violations of law in every shape, alike with the guilty, fall victims to the ravages of mob law. And thus it goes on, step by step, till all the walls erected for the defense of the persons and property of individuals are trodden down and disregarded.
Thank you so much, Victoria.
Um,
This is the moment of imagining what happens when the rule of law goes away. Would you read this with your students? What might you imagine it would bring up for them?
Are you asking me specifically, Sarah?
I would love to hear from you, but anyone else can answer in the chat. I tend to do very conversational things, and I'm in a non-conversational format. So you're welcome to, would love for you to answer, Victoria, but also to answer in the chat.
Yeah, I think it's hard when people get hot-headed for them to act rationally. And the idea of going after innocent people as easily as we go after guilty people, right? That's a very scary thing. Like anyone could be a victim because of that hot-headedness.
And well, actually, Victoria, I love that you said that because, and if Aaron just said, if anyone else would like to be unmuted to use their voice, please let us know. We'd be happy to have you get to speak your words and your thoughts. But Lincoln specifically uses the word passions to describe what needs to be toned down among the people, that people are being driven by their passions rather than reason. And the result is this exact kind of breakdown of law. And I see James Rader's hand is up. I don't know if I can unmute you, but I can try.
James might need to unmute himself, but I added him so that he should be able to talk.
Oh, great. James, go ahead.
You said it was an accident.
Oh, never
Oh,
mind.
forget it. This passage gives you an opportunity to talk with students about the idea that we treat each other well because we operate on an unspoken contract to treat each other well, and that we have laws that we agree upon because we say we agree upon them. But what makes us think, I mean, why do we do that? And what might happen if we didn't? So these are big civic questions in addition to historical questions. And there are opportunities to dig into them from a civic perspective. It's 7:49 Eastern time. I want to create some time for questions, but what I'll do really briefly before we do that is just share, oh, this is the horrible tragedy description of the Lyceum Address, or the Francis McIntosh lynching, is to share with you Lincoln's words here about the revolution. And he says, I do not mean to say that the scenes of the revolution are now or ever will be entirely forgotten, but that like everything else, they must fade upon the memory of the world and grow more and more dim by the lapse of time. In history, we hope they will be read of and recounted as long as the Bible shall be read. But even granting that they will, their influence cannot be what it heretofore has been. Even then, they cannot be so universally known nor so vividly felt as they were by the generation just gone to rest. At the close of that struggle, nearly every adult male had been a participator in some of its scenes. The consequence was that of those scenes, in the form of a husband, a father, a son, or brother, a living history was to be found in every family, a history bearing the indubitable testimonies of its authenticity in the limbs mangled, in the scars of wounds received, in the midst of the very scenes related. A history, too, that could be read and understood alike by all, the wise and the ignorant, the learned and the unlearned. But those histories are gone. They can be read no more forever. They were a fortress of strength, but what invading foeman could never do, the silent artillery of time has done, the leveling of its walls. They are gone. They were a forest of giant oaks, but the all-restless hurricane has swept over them and left only here and there a lonely trunk despoiled of its verdure, shorn of its foliage, unshading and unshaded, to murmur in a few gentle breezes and to combat with its mutilated limbs a few more ruder storms, then to sink and be no more. And I won't read the rest because I don't want to do that to you, but I read that to share with you the power of Lincoln's language to paint a picture for us. And that's what so much of really good 19th century oratory did. And to remind us that in the call to action at the end, he says, we have to recommit ourselves to the vision to our own, not just to the vision, I'm sorry, Erin will correct me, to our own vision and our own reason for keeping this democracy alive. And that's the call for us today. And so I finish with that and would love to open up to comments and questions. And yes, exactly, Victoria. It's what happens in in each generation. The stories of the people who lived through the events are no longer present with us. And so we can't have that deep experience of being with them. Can you imagine what it was like when those people were the Revolutionary War participants? It's hard to imagine.
James and Victoria and Tim and some of the others have also made comments that are a reminder when you were talking, Sarah, about the generative AI version and how it might be easier to understand, but it loses a lot of the poetry. They've also mentioned some of the context, some of the other things that might have been common language to Lincoln and his listeners at that time, literature that they might have all been familiar with, like Shakespeare, or, speeches that other politicians are making, like the I think first governor of Illinois is who James mentioned, and that those would have been things that everyone got the reference, so to speak, that it's a lot harder for us, generation 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 generations on, to really understand those references.
Yeah, absolutely. And Timothy, you said when he uses the word Trump, and I think it now has double meaning, right? But there's so much richness here. And the question for all of us is, how can we offer some of it to students when we can't give them all of it? And so trying to make a determination about what your goals are in teaching this elements of this speech and excerpts of this speech and whether you're teaching the speech primarily to teach the history of this period using the articles, or whether you're using it to try to teach about the whole idea of the rule of law, really honing in on why you want to teach it and what it can be used for. or whether whether you want to use it to teach about why AI is not the answer to all of our problems. Just really think deeply about that. And I don't know if there are other questions or thoughts, but I would love to hear from you all about whether this is a speech that you could imagine teaching. And what parts of this would be most exciting to you to teach?
I did want to point out, Sarah, while they're thinking, because I'd like to give wait time. At the end of the teacher version, there is a Google Doc version. So if you don't think your students, I mean, you haven't looked at the middle school lesson yet. So I do encourage you to look at all 3 levels. But let's say that even the middle school level you think is a little bit too challenging for your particular audience, you can make a copy of that Google Docs version. It won't be as pretty. It won't be in the pretty container, but you can further adapt it as needed for your students. So I just wanted to mention that. Also, there were some comments in the chat about students, I think it was from Victoria, about generations not remembering wars, the Civil War and World War I and World War II, Korea, Vietnam. But we do have kids who maybe when they were in elementary school and now they're in middle or high school, their parents were serving in Afghanistan, or they're currently, we've got students coming from Ukraine as refugees. We have students who right now have relatives over in Gaza and Israel. So we have many students sitting in our classes. This is very real for them. That may resonate with them more so than students who have lived here their entire lives. So just thought I'd throw that in there because of the good comments that were put in there.
That's a great point, that global element of other places where the rule of law has broken down.
James mentioned the muscle memory in the chat about relearning and reteaching democracy on a generational basis.
Yes.
I totally agree.
And Erin, you made a comment about Dr. Ambar's analysis to me about this specific idea.
The idea of the muscle memory?
Yeah.
I'm afraid I don't remember exactly what that was, except that in the context of the speech of it being something that should be part of every public space and every private space. If we're going to really be rededicating ourselves to it, that it's not just in the classroom, but that it should take place all around us in other, third spaces and other community spaces. Lincoln even goes as far as to say that it should be taught in the church. So not the issue of religion being taught in schools, but this idea of our civic values, our political religion, he calls it. And by that, he doesn't mean partisanship. He means rededicating ourselves to these values of representative democracy.
Well, I encourage all of you to, if you're interested in learning more about it, go in, you can read the whole speech. In the links, we have the whole, if you have kids who might be interested, or if you wanted to do it with your history department. And then also we have the AI version of the whole speech, which again, not pretty, not poetic, not nuanced, but
Victoria makes a great point in the chat here about how, a recitation like the Pledge of Allegiance might be said every day, but do students really understand what it means and what it means to recommit to those values? And I think that's an excellent point, Victoria, because there's, recitation of speeches, of pledges, of prayers, whatever it is. Sometimes it's easy to do that by rote without actually stopping and breaking down the meaning. And I love the fact that the learning resources that Sarah and Annie created here do that. And that's something that can be done with any speech or pledge, to actually say, well, what do we really mean by this? And how do we interpret that for today?
And the speech, if you look at the history of the Pledge of Allegiance, it wasn't actually put into practice until we were facing, I believe it was Cold War. Was it either 1920s or 1950s. It was a moment where there was a lot of immigration and we were teaching citizenship. Yep. So yeah. I'm just delighted to have had a chance to meet those of you who are here today. I will share just the last slide. So you have, if you want our information, you can have our information. And we'll wrap up. So
I
here's
also
our
put
last-
the slides in the chat, so you'll have
Great.
this slide along with all of them. If you look in the presenter notes, there's links to a lot of the features of the lessons that we shared so that you can find them. And if you get stuck, just email me and I can walk you through it anytime.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for joining us this evening, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all. And a recording of this session will be posted and you should receive a link to it since you registered for this as well. Thank you all again. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Sarah and Aaron, for having us.